Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Literal Broadcast, the official YouTube channel of Literal. Let me take this brief moment in this segment to communicate to you what Literal actually is. Literal is an e-learning platform that caters especially to English literature students, scholars, and professionals. And we try to provide our audience with the best-in-class online interviews, special lectures like the one that we are going to have now. And let me tell you that this marks the first episode of Expert Library, one of the monthly segments that we are going to have in our channel, Literal Broadcast. And to begin this occasion, I would like to ask Mr. Karthikeyan, one of the content developers of Literal Broadcast, to share a few words about John.
Romanticism is an intellectual movement which originated in Europe and it penetrated the arts, literature, and music of the time. It was at its peak from the years 1800 to 1850. John Keats is an English romantic poet who belonged to the second generation of the romantic poets. He was one of the most influential poets during the second generation alongside Byron and Shelley. Even though initial critical reception of John Keats's works were unfavorable, his reputation started to grow after his death. It was during the end of the 19th century that he became one of the most beloved of all the English poets. Keats's poetry is marked by sensuality and vivid imagery, and these two essential aspects, sensuality and vivid imagery, were mostly evident in his series of odes. Keats's notable works include Ode to a Nightingale, Sleep and Poetry, and the famous sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. The viewers are in for a treat as Professor Sandy takes us through the beautiful poetry of Keats.
Thank you, sir. That was such a great intro for such an amazing segment. But now I would like to give you some introduction about the chief guest of the hour, Professor Mark Sandy, who is live right now, all the way from Durham University from England. So this day could not have a better guest or a more special guest than Professor Mark Sandy, because he is one of the most renowned scholars of the Romantic Age, especially John Keats. And his research on John Keats is published in so many books that focus on so many different things that we have not even heard about. So his research is such a huge contribution to the great poet himself, and we could not pick a much better day than this to go live and start our Expert Library episode 1 with Professor Mark Sandy. And over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you both for that very kind introduction. And it's an honor, of course, to be giving one of these inaugural lectures for your online platform. It is, of course, 31st of October 2020, and it marks, of course, 225 from the birth of John Keats, who was born in 1795 on the 31st of October. In what follows, I'm going to focus mainly on John Keats's odes, 4 of the 5 major spring odes as they're known. And there's another good reason for doing that, because not only is today the anniversary of Keats's birth, but 2020 is also the 200th year anniversary of the publication of Keats's last collection of poems, Lamia, Isabella, the Eve of St. Agnes, and other poems, which of course included a number of the poems that I'll be talking about a little bit later on in this lecture. I'll say something briefly about Keats's life, and it was indeed a very brief and extraordinary life. Keats, as I said, was born in 1795, and he died on the 23rd of February 1821, before his 26th birthday. So he was only 25 years old when Keats passed away in Rome, in Italy. He died, of course, of consumption. And it's made, I think his poetic career is made all the more remarkable by the fact that Keats didn't really start writing poetry until around about 1814. So his actual creative life, his poetic career, as it were, was indeed very short-lived. He was only really writing poetry for about 6 years of the time that he was alive. And I think it's very easy to trace from some of those earlier poems that were mentioned, for instance, on first looking to Chapman's Homer, to the odes, which I'll be talking about, a real maturity and development of Keats as a poet and as a thinker. As much as was said, he's a poet of feeling, he's also very much a poet of thought. He often speculated that what shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. There is a PowerPoint presentation with this lecture. I'm going to start with the very first quotation that I hope you can all see now. This is not Keats, but this is the Irish 20th century Irish poet. He's writing in the 20th century at this point, William Butler Yates. And he's reflecting on Keats and his poetic qualities, but also he's giving us a kind of condensed version, I think, of the sort of reception that Keats received in his own time from contemporary reviewers. I'll just read you this passage. It's from Yates's poem Ego Dominus Tuus, which was published in 1919. Yates says this about Keats. I see a schoolboy when I think of him, with face and nose pressed to a sweet shop window. For certainly he sunk into his grave, his senses and his heart unsatisfied, and made, being poor, ailing, and ignorant, shut out from all the luxury of the world, the coarse-bred son of a livery stable-keeper, luxuriant song. Yates certainly recognises that sensuous, central quality of Keats's poetry, that ability to turn the mundane stuff of life into luxuriant song. But he also interestingly tells us other things about Keats's rather humble origins. He points to the fact that Keats, when he was born on the 31st of October 1795, was indeed born he was the son of a head stableman at a pub in London called the Swan and Hoop. That's what he means by addressing him as the son of a livery stable keeper. He's also pointing out other things too, that although Keats has this yearning for the real, for those sticky sweets, as it were, beyond the glass of the sweet shop window, that he seems to detect, this is Yates detecting in Keats, a kind of inability for Keats to actually get close to the real, to grasp reality. Perhaps he fears that in his luxuriant song there is too much romanticization. And one of the things I will do as I come to talk about the odes is discuss in some ways that I think in this instance Yates is wrong to think of Keats in that way, that Keats is a poet very much in touch with the real, with the contingencies of existence, with the pain of human suffering. The other thing too that Yates is doing in his depiction of Keats as this schoolboy is he's picking up on lots of charges that were levelled against Keats by 19th century contemporary reviewers. Perhaps most notoriously of all, Zed was his alias that he wrote under in the Blackwood magazine. And Keats, partly because of his association with Leigh Hunt and Leigh Hunt's circle, was seen as part of what was called the Cockney School of Poetry, seen as one of the dissenting voices of the time and associated with the radical politics of that time. And as a consequence, again, Yates alludes to it, perhaps because of his background, being of humble origin, being alien and ignorant, as Yates puts it, those reviews were particularly savage on Keats's early poetic output. He was charged with being effeminate, both in his rhymes and his poetic manner. He was seen as being otherworldly, uncouth, and also weak, a kind of weakness stylistically, but also perhaps in sensibility to Keats's poetic character, and indeed his character as a human being. There's a sense in which he's in being charged with effeminacy, he's being thought of as being unmanly. And these are charges that were levelled both at Keats, but also at the so-called Cockney school of rhyme more generally. It's interesting too that this sense of Keats as being weak poetically and as in terms of sensibility as an ad hominem human being is something that Shelley picks up on when Shelley writes his preface to Adonais, the poem that he writes in 1821, which of course is Shelley's elegy for Keats, having heard of his fellow poet's death. And one of the things that Shelley notes in his preface to Adonais is that he believes that Keats has died as a physiological consequence of not being able to withstand the bad reviews that his poetry received. Shelley points to the Quarterly Review rather than Blackwood's magazine, but nonetheless, that there is something in a weakness in Keats's sensibility that precipitates his death, that he can't take criticism, as it were. So there is this kind of myth that builds up around Keats, that he is perhaps weak and unable to grasp the real and engage with it. This is very surprising when we take into account one or two factors of Keats's life, which I'll just say one or two things briefly about. Keats comes from rather humble stock, as I've already pointed out. But one of the things that he did do in his middle years, he trained as an apothecary. An apothecary was a relatively newly emerging profession at the time. It was much more than simply being a pharmacist or chemist, as we might think of it these days. It involved working with surgeons of the day and working particularly as a dresser to surgeons, binding wounds in hospitals. And it required quite a detailed knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and medical science as it was understood at the time. So Keats had a fair share of experience of, quite frankly, the brutality of 19th century medicine. Keats was fortunate in that he was apprenticed to a very good surgeon, a man called Thomas Hammond in Edmonton in London. But there were notorious stories about very bad surgeons of the day, one of whom was known as Billy Lucas. He was known as Billy the Butcher Lucas, and has been described by one of the finer surgeons of the day as cutting amongst sinew and muscle as if they were nothing. So a real high level of incompetence and disregard for the patient. So the point, I think, is that Keats's medical experiences, he qualified in the summer of 1816, is that he had a very sharp grasp of reality, and particularly of medicine in the early 19th century, which was not an entirely pretty affair. So perhaps with just some of those things in mind, and also with Yates's charge of Keats not being able to get at those sticky sweets in the sweet shop window, I want us to think about Keats as a poet that really does grasp the tragedy and dilemma of human existence. But before turning to that, I do want to talk about one of his key ideas, which is that of negative capability. So if we could just move to the next quotation, please, that would be very helpful. And this is a quotation from a letter that Keats writes to George and Thomas Keats. These are his brothers. And he's been thinking about art and the excellence of art. And this is one of his key ideas. I mean, unlike Shelley, Keats doesn't write a kind of manifesto about what he thinks poetry or art does. He doesn't produce a defense of poetry, but his letters offer some very insightful reflections and meditations on what he believes art does. And I'll just read this one to you. He says, "The excellence of every art is its intensity, capable of making all disagreeables evaporate from there being in close relationship with beauty and truth. Examine King Lear, and you will find this exemplified throughout. several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. It's a very interesting definition there. Certainly the importance of feeling, of sensibility, but also that art, poetry enables us to imaginatively to exist in a space where there are no fixities, no definites, no certainties. And I think Keats particularly felt this about the poetic self, that part of writing poetry, part of feeling and breathing the sensations of your poetic object or subject was about a kind of dissolution of self, about a kind of imaginative reaching out of oneself and entry into the very life force and being of the object or subject that you seek to describe. That it is not about a stamping of one's personality on the object of your imaginative gaze, but about the exact opposite, about the very dissolution of self. And if we look to the next quotation, quotation 2 on the PowerPoint, we can see that he elaborates this. This is a little later, just under a year later, he's writing to his friend Richard Woodhouse, and he goes on to speculate this about what forms the poetical character as he sees it. And he comes up with this rather interesting, perhaps unintuitive response to what he believes consists of the poetic self. He says, the poetical character has no self. It is everything and nothing. It has no character. It enjoys light and shade. It lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low. It has as much delight in conceiving in the Iago as an Imogen. So that sense that all states, all modes of being and feeling are open to this kind of negatively capable poetical character, that the self is able to dissolve and live in the instance, the moment of the subject, object that it seeks to describe. I think that's a very important idea, and one that we'll see as we look a little bit more closely at one or two of the odes, written, of course, published in 1820, as I said earlier, but of course written mainly in this magnificent creative year that Keats has in 1819. Before I turn to the odes themselves, I'll say just something about the sequence of them more generally. The odes, of course, written largely from the spring onwards of 1819. There is some debate amongst editors about the precise ordering of the odes in terms of their composition. In some instances, by looking at Keats's letters, it's possible to get quite a sort of accurate sense of the compositional order of them, and in others less so. I'll try to say a little bit about that as we look at each of the odes I'm going to discuss in turn. I'm following the compositional order that seems to be the broad consensus from various editors of Keats, including, of course, John Barnard, Miriam Allard, Elizabeth Cook, but perhaps most importantly of all, Jack Stillinger, who is the great editor of the authoritative edition of Keats's poems, who sadly, I'm afraid to say, passed away in May this year. So that, as a sort of little head note, I want to turn to what then, out of the odes I'm discussing, is the earliest of them. It's written, we believe, from the evidence of Keats's letters in April 1819. It's a poem that the ode to Psyche, which Keats copies out in a letter that he writes to his brother George and his sister-in-law Georgina. And in the version that appears in the letter that he writes, it appears as 3 verse paragraphs. In most editions of the poetry that you'll see, in fact, that the poem appears in 4 verse paragraphs, which is how it appears in an 1820 volume. Ode to Psyche is, of course, an address and a homage to the goddess Psyche. Psyche here, I think, stands for, yes, of course, the goddess herself, but also the implications that the word Psyche has. I mean, but in terms of both soul and mind, and also it's an ode, if you like, to the powers of imagination itself. So Psyche here, I think, is standing in for a number of these things: the soul, the mind, and also the imagination. He's offering a kind of hymn, if you like, to the imagination. If we look at the quotation, which is now displayed for us, we can see how it starts in a kind of slightly casual sort of way. And there's a degree of specifics given, but also a degree of uncertainty. Keats writes this: "O goddess, hear these tuneless numbers rung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear, and pardon that thy secrets should be sung, even into thine own soft-conched ear. Surely I dreamt today, or did I see the winged Psyche with awakened eyes?" There's a kind of specificity to the scene. There's a sense in which our poet-speaker stumbles upon Psyche and her lover, as it were. There's a sense in which it's something that he physically glimpses, sees, and yet at the same time it seems to belong to the world of poetic vision. Those awakened eyes suggest, yes, perhaps awakened consciousness, but then it's offset against the remark just before in the previous line: "Surely I dreamt today, or did I see?" Very typical of Keats that he introduces a kind of epistemological uncertainty, a confusion, if you will, between modes of knowing and modes of being conscious or unconscious, of being awake or asleep. The casualness is emphasized further in the next quotation. If we could have that would be wonderful. Where we see Keats pick up on this very interesting way of expressing things. He says, "I wandered in a forest thoughtlessly, and on a sudden fainting with surprise, saw two fair creatures couched side by side in deepest grass beneath the whispering roof of leaves and trembled blossoms." So that's the next quotation on the PowerPoint. And that thoughtlessly works so wonderfully well, that sense of just nothing in particular. The mind is roaming, as is the figure, through the forest. And then he happens upon these figures of Cupid and Psyche. There perhaps is a sense too of transgression, a touch of perhaps the voyeuristic here, that he espies these two figures glimpsed in, as it were, in the glade of the forest, and a sense too that's emphasized by the catalogue of the various flora and fauna that Keats gives in the next few lines, that perhaps recalls Milton's listing of the woods and plants that populate the Garden of Eden in Paradise Lost. And Milton is often in Keats's mind. In fact, the lines that I read just a moment ago, where he's talking about sweet enforcement and remembrance dear, also echo Milton's elegy for Edward King, Lycidas. So there are often echoes of Miltonic verse in Keats too. From what starts in a very casual way, that kind of forest thoughtlessly, the poem affects an interesting sort of move or change. We imagine at the beginning that we are somewhere, even if we're not sure whether we're awake or asleep, out there in the world. By the close of the poem, however, we seem to have moved very definitely into an inner and inward state. The poem seems to close in a much more psychic or imaginative landscape. We have moved, as it were, from what was observed as from being in the forest thoughtlessly to a scene that is now created, as Keats tells us, in some untrodden region of my mind, where branched thoughts new grow in the pleasant pain. So there is a change here, I think. We move, as it were, from a world that opens with ruminations of nothing in particular, a kind of casual, thoughtless wandering, as I said, and those carefree thoughts and that carefree scene, that sense of daydreaming, are substituted by the very end of the poem with a very deliberately constructed world of thought and vision. It's a world of thought and vision. Forgive me, this line isn't on the handout, but I'll just read it to you. This is the very end of Keats's ode. He says here that the garden, the rosy sanctuary that he will construct in his mind, is made with the wreathed trellis of a working brain. And by the very close of the poem, we're aware that there is a casement left open in this scene. There shall be for thee all soft delight that shallowy thought can win, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in. And in that sense, that affirmation of the warm love seems to point to some sense of success. One of the aims of this hymn to the imagination for Keats is to establish the appropriate poetic honours, as it were, for a goddess Psyche who went unrecognised in her own time, who was not recognised as one of the great Olympians. And his ode, in part, attempts to redress that imbalance, to ensure that Psyche is appropriately recognised and praised. Curiously, though, for all that the ode affirms that possibility, it also at the same time undoes and unweaves the possibility of such praise being possible. You might note, of course, what Keats referred to in that opening line as tuneless numbers. What do tuneless numbers look or sound like? Is it a self-conscious nod to Keats's own writing of the ode? Does the ode itself comprise such tuneless numbers? And indeed, Psyche, for all that she is physically invoked as a presence in the poem, remains absent from it. She's caught between this world of possible actuality and daydream. Indeed, we see her presented in the course of the ode as mere synecdoches of things, of pinions and lucent fans, but never fully realised in the poem. It's almost as if Keats's hymn to the imagination, that the ode is dramatising its own seeking out the possibility of praising and representing Psyche, but discovering, in fact, in doing so, the impossibility of finding an poetic figure to represent Psyche, whether we think of her as a goddess or a poetic soul or the creative mind itself. And I think too that darkness, that ope at night, the casement ope at night at the close, suggests something more sinister at work too. Perhaps it points to the poem's own doubts about the ability of the warm love to ultimately attend to this imaginative act of creation on behalf and in honour of Psyche. It perhaps fears that the mythologizing of Psyche as this great and famed goddess is not, in fact, possible. And I think the poem is haunted by this sense of absence, Psyche's absence, and her supplementary replacements by these lucent fans and pinions. It's haunted too by that possibility of darkness that lurks outside, beyond that self-constructed vision that the poem strains so hard to create by its close. There is a sense of the limitations of fiction, of myth, that there is pressing in upon this very fragile, created interior landscape, the darkness of contingency, of transient reality, all of the things that threaten this beautifully crafted, outer-branched thought and the trellis of a working brain, this beautifully crafted rosy sanctuary that the world of the real threatens its very existence. And Keats, in his ode, is very concerned with that tension between what we might think of as kind of imaginative flight and the reality that often are the spur to them, that often drive him to flee the reality but often his odes enact a kind of return to the very reality and contingencies that they seek to escape. The Psyche is an ode in terms of its structure and its sort of stanzaic structural forms, is perhaps different from the other odes that I'll be looking at, namely Ode to a Nightingale in just a moment, and then Ode on a Grecian Urn until Autumn. As I said, it's arranged in much more loose verse paragraphs, and it's the beginning of Keats, I think, thinking about the stanzaic form that he actually evolves for the subsequent odes, which are constructed in their stanzaic form. And we'll see as we turn to Ode to Nightingale that Keats is beginning to experiment with this idea of a kind of 10-line stanza, which is comprised of a quatrain and then a sestet. So he's really sort of, as it were, producing a kind of hybrid stanza that is indebted to both the English and Italian sonnet form. And I think the other feature that's more marked in Ode to Nightingale, which we'll turn to in just a moment, is this sense of tension, of if you like, debate almost of the poetic self with itself. I mean, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Arnold, the great Victorian critic and poet, he talks about a dialogue of the mind with the mind, and I think that's quite a good way of thinking about the oscillations, if you like, that we see in Keats's odes, this movement away from the real and this return to the real. It's also about a debate of the mind with itself. If we could just stay with that quotation, that's great. I mean, we see here, it's this quotation that's displayed here from Ode to a Nightingale. This is a moment in the ode where the speaker is very, very aware of the reality of death, of the transience of existence, of the pressures of the real. He says this: where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where better think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Now, this is precisely one of those moments in the ode where the Keats as speaker is brought very, very firmly back to the real, to the reality of death. Biographically, the line is often thought of by editors as alluding to the death of his brother Tom. Tom died in December 1818. Tom, Keats' brother, also sadly died of consumption, and Keats had nursed Tom through part of his illness, so there's a very poignant sense of the real there. But it's very different from how the ode begins. The ode begins with this sense of retreat from reality, in fact. It starts with a sense of my heart aches as though of hemlock I had drunk. It's a kind of descent and a retreat from the real into a more dreamlike kind of state. It's a poem that moves downwards and away from reality into what Keats refers to a little earlier as the deep delved earth. It is very much a downward and retreat from the real, which only leads the speaker to think about what it is that he seeks to escape. He suddenly realizes that the fever and the fret that he seeks to escape in the poem is never known by the nightingale, which is, of course, the addressee in this poem, and it makes him think back to all of those things that he seeks to escape imaginatively in the course of the poem. By contrast, as we see here in this next quotation on the PowerPoint, we see the nightingale emerge as this triumphant, immortal, transcendental figure that transcends the pain and misery of human existence, I'll just read these lines to you. Thou was not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home, she stood in tears amid the ailing corn. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of peerless seas and fairylands. Forlorn. Well, this moment occurs after Keats, having confronted the reality of death, as with that poor spectral figure of the dying youth, he starts to think about death in a more romanticized way, refers to her as a darkling that he's listened to for many a time, and I've been half in love with easeful death. So the ode presents, if you like, two versions of death, one of which is the brute reality of the facts of the matter, and the other is death almost romanticized as a kind of courtly lover, a figure that Keats as speaker might woo and beckon to him so that he might die up on the midnight with no pain, as he puts it. Emerges here then as supposedly immortal. It transcends time and space and place. It's been heard by both the lowly and the great, by emperor and clown. It both exists in the historical realm, but it also exists in the biblical and the mythological. For instance, through the sad heart of Ruth, clearly a figure drawn from the Bible there. So it is transcendent in all ways. And what we might expect by the very close of the ode, as the poet has been constantly thinking about and entertaining the ways in which he might dissolve himself, a kind of act of self-dissolution. He's been thinking about the possibility of imbibing alcohol at the beginning. There's an option he refuses. He then thinks about the possibility of the poetic imagination, of the wings of poesy, as he puts it. He rejects that because each time he thinks of a possible mode of escape, the poem brings him back against the reality that he seeks to elide. Curiously, one of the great ironies of Ode to Nightingale is that we might expect at the very close of the poem that it's going to be the poet speaker that will be buried, that it will be some marking of his passing that we experience at the end of the poem. But in a kind of ironical twist, what we see, in fact, is that it is the Nightingale's song that's buried in the next valley glade, and not the poet himself. The poet is left in a state perhaps similar to the one that we saw depicted at the beginning of Ode to Psyche, where, in fact, he cannot tell whether he is awake or asleep, left in a kind of ontological and epistemological state of confusion about the exact nature of the experience that he has had, and the exact mode of experiencing that the poem closes in. So it is very much a kind of oscillation, a vacillation, a debate between the self about what art and poetry might offer us in terms of escape and consolation for the contingencies of the real, and the fact that so often our attempted imaginative flights from the real bring us back much more acutely to the reality of the situation. And that forlorn, that word there that ends the quotation I've just read, of peerless seas and fairylands, forlorn, is the very word that Keats tells us at the beginning of the next stanza, that is like a bell that tolls thee back to thee, my soul self. So he's brought back to the reality of himself, a self that has been changed, of course, by the imaginative experience and flight that he has undertaken, but one nonetheless that is uncertain about the lesson to be extracted from that experience by the close of the poem. I think too, I mentioned that Milton, of course, was very much in Keats's mind in Ode to Psyche, and I think he's in Keats's mind too when he writes Ode to Nightingale. The word dark is a very Miltonic word. It speaks back to Paradise Lost, Book 3, and the invocation there of light, where Milton invokes the nightingale as the darkling bird. And Keats, when he chooses to write an ode to a nightingale, does so very self-consciously. He knows that he's writing himself into and out of a long-established literary tradition that goes back, yes, to Milton and Paradise Lost, and also his shorter lyric, Il Penseroso, but also, of course, there are other great romantic lyrics on the subject of nightingales. Coleridge's conversation poem, The Nightingale, Wordsworth to a Cuckoo, I think, is influential here, but also, of course, Charlotte Smith's on the Return of the Nightingale too. So it's a very strong literary tradition of writing about the nightingale. The nightingale has a great appeal to the poet, I think, because it represents a kind of unpremeditated pouring forth of song, the very kind of unself-conscious artistry to which Keats as a poet aspires. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the opening of this poem, is that in some ways what he's seeking is yes, a repression of the real, but I think more importantly, a repression of his own self-consciousness. What he desires more than anything else, as the poet speaker of Ode to a Nightingale, is to be able to pour forth his unpremeditated song without the sense and burden of self-consciousness that he suffers. It's very striking that opening of Ode to Nightingale. It's a very good instance of the kind of sensuality and emphasis on the senses that was mentioned in the introduction to this lecture, where he talks about my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I have drunk, or emptied some dull opiates the drains, one minute past and the lily water had sunk. Now, people often think of those lines as being a wonderful imaginative capturing of a sense of absolute numbness and loss of sensation and feeling. I think it's more than that. I think it's where Keats is at his very best. It's about an acute sense of the loss of feeling to such a degree that loss of feeling becomes in itself a positive sensation. It's what Keats calls elsewhere the feel of not to feel, that the absence of feeling is so absolutely acute that it becomes itself a kind of positive sensation. And it's that sense of wanting to abate consciousness that really drives the associative logic of Ode to Nightingale. But what happens each time that he attempts to contemplate one particular mode of achieving a lack of self-consciousness, whether it be through drinking that wonderful blush-filled hippocrene of the wine, or whether it be through the imagination, or whether it be even through some darker suicidal thought, as he woos the darkling death, he's brought back all the time to the real and the sense of attachment to the reality that he seeks to escape. And Keats formalizes perhaps more explicitly these concerns in Ode on a Grecian Urn, which we have some quotations from next on the PowerPoint. And I think in Ode on a Grecian Urn, Keats is addressing some of the questions that are perhaps more implicitly present in Ode to a Nightingale, because he's thinking explicitly about art and the constellations of art and what they are, if any, and can art, in this case in the form of this ancient relic, the Grecian urn, can it offer us some sense of compensation, if you will, for our mortal existences? And we have the opening lines here, which I'll just read. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, Sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. So questions here about art more explicitly, but it starts with a dilemma which is familiar to that of the beginning of Ode to a Nightingale. Keats' his own poetic powers, his own sense of eloquence is being challenged by the very presence of the Grecian urn. She, after all, is a foster child of silence and slow time. She's unravished bride of quietness, and yet her silence, her refusal, if you like, to speak, is more eloquent than Keats's own poetry. So there is a real sense here that the poet speaker, poet observer, if you will, in this ode, wants to somehow match the eloquence of the urn, but this is very difficult because, of course, the urn's eloquence is dependent upon her silence. And we can see, in fact, in the next quotation, I think there's a sense of anxiety and frustration on the speaker poet's behalf here, because he feels need almost to assault the unravished bride of quietness and her silence with these almost hysterical kind of questions, kind of bombards her with the questions that he sort of throws out to her. What men, it's the next quotation on the handout, what men or gods are these? What maidens loathe? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? And it is almost as if it's a sort of verbal assault, I think, by Keats on the silence of the Grecian urn that almost threatens to undo his poetic ability. What we also learn, of course, of the urn is that in its transcendent state, I mean, that it transcends history, time, and space. Again, that key word in that opening line is "thou still." Still is a wonderfully compressed word there. It means, of course, her stationary. You know, she is an inanimate, unmoving object. It means too that she is still in a continual sense of being still, that is continually going on, and she continually occupies time. So that sense of stillness, that double sense of stillness, is very important in the ode on the Grecian urn. By contrast, we live in a world of change and transience. The urn occupies this world of seeming eternity and transcendence, where we're told in the next quotation on the PowerPoint, we encounter observed by Keats's speaker observer, and we see here the kind of existence that they enjoy. A happy melodist unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above. Well, you know, these figures seem to encapsulate that sense of eternity. Notice how the repetition of forever, forever panting, forever young, forever warm. Notice the repetition too of happy love. There may be in that repetition there, perhaps the word happy rings a little bit hollow for Keats, that it kind of empties itself of true happiness and meaning by its sort of repeated use there, and that may be true too of forever, because what it does, like an ode to Nightingale, for all that he feels the appeal and the draw of these immortal and transcendent figures depicted on the urn, it makes him think back to his own life, the world of changeability, and it makes him think about the very things that they escape, that forever panting and forever young. Yes, they are, but they are all breathing human passion far above. And we see the figure of the lover, in fact, on the urn, always poised on the moment of the consummation of the relationship, but never actually attaining the consummation of that relationship. And Keats is brought back to think about the world of the real, and about, in fact, is it not better to have all breathing human passion far above and a heart high sorrowful and cloyed? Is it not better to have the moment to live life than it is to, in effect, to enjoy the eternity that the art of the urn seemingly offers us. The urn is, like the Nightingale, unlike Psyche in that earlier ode, a curious object. It's an object that Keats, perhaps because of his sensuous language, seems to really make us feel is present in the urn. But as we saw with Psyche, she seems to be an absenting figure from her own ode to Psyche. And equally, the Nightingale doesn't seem very actually present in the Nightingale ode. At most, it might be some kind of imaginative response to her song, but never the physical presence of the nightingale bird itself. And equally in Ode on a Grecian Urn, we may feel the solidity of the urn. We noticed that too, that the speaker seems to move around the urn within the museum space of the poem, moves away from the depiction of the figures of the lovers to what he describes, it's the next quotation on the handout, to what he describes as seemingly finding on the other side of the urn, another image that he espies, and it's of a little town. Thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou desolate can e'er return. It's a very curious scene that Keats depicts on the other side of the urn. He can't quite tell, and it's these moments of uncertainty that are creeping in. We saw that sense of doubt about whether he was waking or sleeping. Here there seems some imaginative doubt about whether it's a little town or it's a citadel, or whether it's by a river or a seashore. We feel almost as if the scene that's depicted on the other side of the urn is more of an imaginative composite than an actual description of something on a physical Grecian urn or relic of that time. And again, the urn is being used as a vehicle, as a way of enabling this debate of the mind with the mind about the value and the worth of art, and whether it can console and offer compensation for our mortal existence. And the urn, like the Nightingale, moves it in that kind of oscillating way that it sees and feels the appeal of the urn, but at the same time finds itself always drawing back to the real and the lived world of experience and the world of human passion. In the end, by the very close of the Ode on a Grecian Urn, we almost see the speaker kind of denounce the urn. He refers to her as a kind of cold pastoral, that there is something limited about the sense of transcendence and eternity that the urn as a piece of art might offer us. And yet, to capture that sense of uncertainty and confusion, and remember, of course, negative capability depends upon being caught in these moments of mysteries, doubts, uncertainties, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The urn is still a friend to man. The Ode on a Grecian Urn ends with, I haven't put it on the handout because it's so famous, ends with one of Keats's most famous declarations, that the urn either says, depending on whether there are quotation marks there or not, there are versions of the poem that appear with the quotation marks, and there are versions of the poem that appear without them, but the urn seems to announce at the end, or the speaker announces to the urn, or the figures on it, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. It seems like a very declarative final statement that perhaps at last Keats, as speaker of the Odes, has found a way of extracting a very definite lesson. And it certainly chimes with one of Keats's other maxims that we find in his letters, where he talks about what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth. But we're still left, I think, questioning and wondering, what is the nature of this truth? How, if the urn is a cold pastoral, does it convey a truth to us? If it's a cold pastoral, how is it a friend to man? What comfort, consolation does, in fact, the urn really offer us? And this is a question about which a lot of ink has been spilt, and there may be no one certain answer. One thing I would like to suggest is, though, that this beauty and this truth to which the final lines of Ode and Grecian Urn refer to, perhaps suggests a kind of, and I'm thinking again of W.B. Yates, who I quoted at the very beginning, who talks of a terrible beauty that is born, a beauty that encompasses, yes, the beauty of art and its apparent stillness in that double sense of the word that I used, and its ability to transcend life, but also a terrible beauty that encompasses the harshnesses, the limitations of existence. After all, the Grecian Urn, in one aspect, is a work of art as it's presented to us here. And art must speak to us, must be born of the lives that we live and lead. Art does not exist in some kind of abstracted vacuum. Art has to speak back to the realities that we know. And perhaps in that sense, it is a beauty that encompasses both the ideal aspirations of art, its transcendence, but also the very reality from which it is born. And one thing that I think perhaps helps sort of justify that kind of existential reading is to think that, of course, a Grecian urn isn't simply produced as an artwork, but that it once had a function in social ritual, that a Grecian urn, of course, would have been used to contain the funereal ashes. It had a place in the ritual and communal practices of mourning to contain the ashes of the dead. So for all of its sense of eternity, for all of its stillness, the urn as an object, as it were, is one that is intimately connected with the real life of society and individuals, but also recognizes the very transience and limitations and mortality of that existence. So I think it's always interesting to think in terms of the urn being much more connected with reality than simply something that transcends the real. I want to close by turning to autumn. To autumn is the last of the odes in the spring ode sequence, and obviously written a little bit later. We can be a little bit more precise about the dating of To Autumn, partly because of a letter that Keats writes around about the time that he composes this ode. And so we can be pretty certain that it was composed between the 19th and the 21st of September 1819, and that in fact, in all probability, that Keats in his letter refers to composing the ode whilst he's staying in Winchester, that he went for a walk on a Sunday. And so it seems quite likely that much of the ode was composed on the 19th of September, which would have been that Sunday of 1819. It's an ode that develops that stanzaic structure that I was talking about earlier on, where we have a kind of quatrain, a sestet, a 10-lined stanza. Here into Autumn, Keats adds an 11th line to this 10-lined stanzaic structure. And that may, I think, partly be to reflect the sense of excess that the poem is so concerned with. It's a poem that from its very beginning sees the whole of the season of autumn coming to a final state of maturation and the end of natural processes. We have to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel to set budding more and still more. There's a sense of a kind of long summer that's stretched into the autumn, and that everything that is about to reach its kind of final peak of fruition. It's not quite there yet, but it is certainly pressing towards that final stage. I mean, it is perhaps the most quintessentially kind of English autumn, I suppose, that Keats realizes in his poem. And it does seem in sort of manner and tone initially to be quite different, perhaps, from Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to Nightingale. It doesn't have that kind of oscillating structure, that kind of debate of the self with the self that we saw in the movement of Ode to Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn. It seems initially to be a poem that's much more concerned with the descriptive and the kind of local descriptive of this magnificently realized autumnal scene. And yet, there are a couple of moments later where we see that kind of self-consciousness creeping back into the poem. But initially, at least, from its opening lines, I'll just read you these, they're not on the PowerPoint, but I'll just read you the very famous opening lines of this ode. Seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the moss cottage trees. It's a wonderful example of the way that human and natural processes are enmeshed so closely in Keats's To Autumn that they're indistinguishable from one another. In fact, the implied there with the moss cottage trees presumably is a human dwelling. There is somewhere in that scene a cottage where humans dwell, but Keats's purpose here seems to be very deliberately to ensure that human consciousness and natural process are beautifully melded together so that they're almost indistinguishable from one another. In a sense, I suppose, if we think of To Autumn as a poem that's coming off the back of Ode on a Grecian Urn, we might say that To Autumn substitutes art for natural process. Nature, represented among other things by the industry of the bees that we see at the beginning, does our thinking for us. There's a wonderful moment where he says that for summers overbrim their clammy cells. He's talking to the bees, and he says that they think warm days will never cease. So that sense of the human and the natural coming beautifully together, it's a transferred epithet. The bees are the ones doing the thinking and not us. So that sense of exchange between the natural and the human world is, I think, very important to autumn. There is, of course, a moment later where we see, just before the lines are on the handout that I'll come to in just a moment, where a question enters into the poem. It opens the final stanza of the poem, and the speaker that's always been there, but again is beautifully melded into the natural processes that's described. It says, "Where are the songs of spring? Ah, where are the songs of spring? Think not of them, thy has thy music too." So there's a moment then that we're suddenly aware that there is a kind of human consciousness that is through which this scene is being mediated, but it's very much abated in contrast to, say, Ode on a Grecian Urn, or indeed Ode to a Nightingale. There are many subtle things that Keats does in this ode to ensure that sense of process that's been set in motion, that is moving towards an end point, but an end point that is never arrived at. And the quotation that we have here is a good example of that. "On a half-reaped fowl sound asleep, drowse with the fumes of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe in all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings as by as." And this is one of the many kind of vignettes, personifications that we have of To Autumn as a season in the poem. Here we see her engaged in a number of harvesting activities, or indeed not engaged, because one of the things that she should be doing is bringing in the corn with her scythe, that's the hook, She should be bringing in the corn, but at this moment in time, she's abated from the activity of harvesting because she's been drowsed by the fume of poppies and it is having a rest. We see autumn then in the next couple of lines as a gleaner, someone bringing in the ears of the corn from the harvest, balancing the basket of corn on her head. And then we see her in another stage of process here, watching the cider press with patient look, the last oozings as by as. And again, it's that melding of natural process and human thought consciousness that seems to be in play here. Those last oozings as by as may well be the last drops of the cider being pressed as they're being made in preparation for fermentation. But I think also those last oozings as by as strike a very existential kind of a note. And if we think of to autumn here as a kind of female figure with her sighs now spared for a moment or two because of the drowsiness of the opiate effect of the nearby poppies, we perhaps see a softened down female figure of the Grim Reaper. We know that death is coming, but here she's presented in this much more paternal, much more acceptable kind of image, and she patiently watches the last oozings as by as, not just of the cider, but of our own human existences. And the whole poem lives in this beautifully balanced and poised moment between what it describes as where the light wind lives or dies. The whole poem occupies this curious kind of middle space between living and dying, breathing and not breathing, being and non-being. It is a beautifully poised ode that recognizes, I think, the very necessity, but more importantly, the fact that death and the end point to which death brings us, that final terminus, is very much part of natural process. One I always think quite interesting instance of that is in the final stanza where Keats talks about full-grown lambs, loud bleat from hilly bourne. And I'm always very struck that Keats chooses that adjectival description. Full-grown lambs. Well, full-grown lamb is a sheep, and Keats clearly knew the word sheep. But full-grown lambs allows for that sense of process that's set in motion, that sense of maturation that hasn't yet quite reached its final endpoint. To autumn, in that sense, for me at least, I think is the culmination of the odes. It deals with many of the same kinds of debates about art and whether art can offer us consolation, but it does so in a much more muted and hushed kind of tone. We don't feel so much the self-consciousness of the dynamism and self-consciousness of that debate being enacted into autumn. It's a much more quiet and a muted affair. Not to say, of course, that autumn doesn't have its own self-consciousness. There are moments, for instance, when the doubt about the lack of the music of spring creeps in, that we are aware of a consciousness still mediating this experience to us. I'll say something by way of conclusion. One thing that we might say about the odes more generally is that they have a way of variously realizing their dramatic shifting fictions, their imaginative flights and their returns. I mean, this is, I think, very much the kind of shape and arc of Keats's spring odes. They do have, I think, a modus of consciousness to them that counter often an idealizing impulse to settle for the stability of transcendent vision or art, and that these mythic visions remain a residual presence as they're replayed through a series of humanizing, often fictional substitutions. We can see that, I think, in the exchange and the moulding between natural process and the human into autumn, but also too, I think, the way that the urn finally speaks back to the reality of our own transient situation. Such substitutions, imaginatively realized, delight, I think, in what Keats calls, when he defines the negative capable self, as uncertainties mysteries and doubts. And so often the closing point of Keats's odes seek to re-engage with the very reality, temporality and death that seemingly their imaginative flights look to elide or escape from. I think unexpectedly and lost sometimes a poetic vision as it's played out in the odes spurs us both as readers and Keats as poetic speaker to reconnect with the self and the real. And it does so, I think, through a series of self-conscious fictions that trace and define a sense of an ending, not just an ending of stanzaic patterns and poetic form, but a very real sense of an ending of life itself. And Keats, through his medical training, would have been all too well aware, as he was through the death, his untimely death of his younger brother Tom, would have been all too well aware of what it is to grapple with a sense of an ending, both formally as a poet, but also existentially as a person who had lost too many loved ones and who himself was to die at such a very young age. Thanks for listening. I'll leave it in those terms.
Well, there you have it, folks. Another great session by Professor Mark Sandy. And I think Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to Autumn are some of the poems that are prescribed in universities across India. And I think it's a very familiar poem to all of us. And I think you have given a very deep explanation regarding the interpretation of what those solid lines of Keats meant. And now I would like to call upon Dr. P. Sashikala, one of the content developers at Literary, to have the Q&A session for this episode of Expert Library.
Sure.
That was indeed a very informative session about Keats. I hope all would have really enjoyed the session to the core. And to the question and answer session, we have a question from one of our YouTube viewers, Ms. Ranjana Mehrotra. Her question is, the last lines of Ode on a Grecian Urn are very similar to the Indian concept of Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. Do you agree? How do you correlate the concepts of beauty and truth as evinced by Keats?
Well, I mean, it's a very difficult phrase of Keats to unpick. One way of doing it, I don't know enough about Indian philosophy, forgive me, but one way, of course, of doing it would be to think about it in terms of a kind of Neoplatonic statement that, you know, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that you could see perhaps Keats as advocating some sense of, you know, kind of a Platonic understanding that, you know, that you know, truth, as it were, exists in the ideal realm, you know, beyond reality, and that beauty is one way of accessing it. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that particular kind of reading of Keats as a kind of Neoplatonist. I mean, there are certainly critics that have thought of it in that way. I suppose I'm closer to something like I have Friedrich Nietzsche, the later German philosopher, in my head. And he writes about art. He says that art must make us face all that is hard and questionable and difficult in life. And I think that's, for me, is what I take Keats to be doing with the urn. I mean, there are lots of subtleties in play in that final stanza. I mean, for instance, when he talks about the breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, there he's punning on the word breed. Breed there means both the braiding, the kind of stone rope work pattern that is on the urn, but it also means that he's pointing out the very thing that the lovers on the urn can't do. They can't breed, they can't procreate. So there's a kind of both a recognition of something appealing about the urn, but also a limitation of the urn at the same time. And they're overwrought because I think more importantly, they could be emotionally overwrought because they're not able to consummate their relationship. But they're overwrought too, because I think Keats is making a statement about what he thinks of his own poem. I mean, one way of thinking about overwrought is that it's too fussy, it's too complicated, it's been overly made. And I think you could read Keats as saying that's what he thinks about his own ode. That there's not really a Grecian urn in that ode, in the way there isn't really a Nightingale in Ode to Nightingale, but actually what there is the urn that's been sculpted out of words by Keats. Keats has made there. That's why that second scene, that scene of the little town, is so uncertain. It's much more of a composite. Keats is inventing that. So I mean, I think you could. I mean, I think those things make me feel much more uncertain about having a very definite reading of Beauty is Truth, Truth Beauty. As for how it connects with Indian philosophy, I think I would need you help on that in terms of explaining the concept to me, so that I could understand more fully how that might connect with Keats's statement.
So thank you, sir. I think this would have answered the question of the concerned person. And now moving on to the next question, there's a kind of a dilemma, a kind of a confusion about Keats' birthday actually. Some people believe it to be on 29th of October and some say it is on 31st. What is the reason behind?
The best thing to consult is probably Nick Rowe's biography of Keats, but my understanding from memory is that that there are a number of Keats's relatives that seem to claim that I think he was born on the 29th, not the 31st. As far as I can see, on the whole, that there seems to be a reasonable consensus around the fact that Keats was born on the 31st of October. But there were, as it were, at the time, relatives that seemed to claim that Keats was born maybe 1 or 2 days earlier in October. So, but as I say, I think more recent biographies of Keats have tended to uphold the 31st of October as his birthday.
So, thank you, sir. But we have preferred it to be 31st of October, for it was convenient for us to make it possible on that day.
Well, I can only say that I was in email correspondence with Professor Beth Lau, one of the great, she edited that wonderful edition of Keats' Annotations to Paradise Lost, and she referred to the 31st of October as Keats' birthday. So that's good enough for me.
Yes, sir. We have another viewer, Ms. Shanmuga Priya, with a question. Her question is, can you relate Keats' use of Hellenism with regard to his Ode to Autumn?
Yes, you probably could. I mean, and there are some interesting studies done, at least one major study done of Keats and Hellenism by Martin Aske, A-S-K-E. And in fairness, a lot of that tends to gravitate probably towards some more pastoral flora pan kind of poetry. But I think you could, and I think Andrew Bennett in his reading of To Autumn has gone some way towards it. I think if you connected it with the idea of cornucopia and the Horn of Plenty, I think you could do a kind of, you could see, I mean, I saw the kind of Keats's personifications of To Autumn as a kind of much more universal figure of the kind of Grim Reaper or Death in a kind of feminized, a softened down kind of figure. But I think you could probably see To Autumn also as a representation of Demeter. I see no reason why you couldn't then open up a kind of reading of the whole poem that would place it within the kind of Hellenist culture and mythology. Yeah, certainly. Andrew Bennett would be someone to look at actually in Keats' narrative and audience. He has an interesting reading of To Autumn that picks up on that cool idea of cornucopia.
That's indeed a right explanation needed for Ms. Shanmuga Priya. We have another viewer with us, Mr. Amol Gomare, who says that his question is, John Keats saying in Ode to Autumn that a lady with a load on her head and crossing the brook, maybe
The
she was
gleaner,
inspired by the Indian situation. What is your opinion on that?
You mean the political and historical situation in which the poem is written? Yeah.
No, the scenario actually is explaining, I believe. The scenario of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right, because the word that Keats uses is gleaner, which is an interesting word, and perhaps a word not that familiar to people. To glean was the activity of going onto the fields after they'd been harvested and bringing in the remaining ears of corn. You could say it was a common law right in England for a long time, that you could go and collect the remaining ears of corn and take them home and use them for your own purposes, to make bread or whatever. And by the time that Keats is writing to autumn, England has experienced some very poor harvests, and the harvests have not been good at all. And the right to glean, that common law right, had been repealed, so that you couldn't go on to the fields anymore and gather up for corn, which was a bad time because the harvests were bad. There was a feeling of political unrest, economic uncertainty, but also the masses were hungry because the harvest had been poor. And in fact, it's an interesting point, because the figure of Ruth in Ode to Nightingale that I mentioned, that we see her stood midst the alien corn, that might also be another nod towards this political change, this loss of the right to glean, because in the biblical story of Ruth, when she goes away from her homeland, isn't unhappy. In fact, she has a very contented and happy life. Whereas Keats seems to suggest that the figure of Ruth, she finds herself amid the alien corn, alienated by the situation in which she finds herself. And he might be slightly rewriting that story as a nod again towards the loss of the right to glean, that she effectively is a kind of, supplanted from the Bible, but then represented to us as a kind of gleaner that now finds the corn alien to her, because she's not allowed to bring in the ears of corn anymore, which had once been a common law right. So, I mean, there are lots of other things into autumn that you could read in a more socio-economic, political way. People make much, for instance, that conspires, that word, that sense of conspiracy at the beginning of the poem. Clouds are barred, that there's a sense of imprisonment, and there's also a nod at the very end of the poem. If we think about agricultural change, you remember that you've got the redbreast, that whistles from a garden croft at the close of that poem. Well, that might be a nod towards the practice of enclosure as well, and the breaking up of larger land into smaller plots. So there is a sense of kind of imprisonment, constriction. And Keats may be interesting. I mean, people have written about this quite a lot. Andrew Bennett, who I mentioned earlier, has. I mean, the most famous reading, of course, of To Autumn in terms of political economic terms, it will be Jerome McGann's, Keats and the Literary Historical Method, and when was it, Modern Language Association, 1971. I mean, it's the beginning of the whole new historicist response to romanticism and romantic poetry more generally. So. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the figure of the gleaner is a very interesting one, and Keats seems very particular there about that word. I mean, that said, I mean, there are a lot of very anglicized, Anglo-Saxon words into autumn. It's probably the least kind of Latinate of all of the odes. If you think about plaintive, for example, that you have in Ode to Nightingale, he seems very concerned to get very kind of stodgy, solid Anglo-Saxon words in there. And when he writes in that letter that I alluded to about composing to autumn, he's writing to Richard Woodhouse, he says he associates autumn. He says he thinks about Diane's skies and how beautiful it is, but he associates the season of autumn with Chatterton and Gower. So he's thinking about it as being a very, not just an English season somehow, but also somehow rooted in the very language itself and the very culture of being very English in that kind of a way. Somehow he has that association in his mind. And gleaner perhaps is again another one of those words that's kind of it's stolid and solid, isn't it? It's not necessarily particularly poetic. So there may be other reasons too, but certainly the political situation is a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about Keats as kind of, the whole poem is that, in a way you could argue, the whole of To Autumn is a signpost to precisely what isn't happening in England at that moment in time. It's almost like a sort of pastoral elegy that he's offering us an autumn that we once would have experienced and have known, but that's not how autumns are now. It's kind of retrospective regret for what's been lost, as it were. I mean, I prefer the existential reading. I mean, Paul H. Fry once famously said of To Autumn that the only right register to read that poem is an existential one. Well, we can debate that, but
that's indeed a detailed explanation for the question asked by Mr. Ramol. And he's here with another question.
Oh, okay, good.
What does negative capability mean in today's scenario? Has it changed from the previous concept?
Well, I don't know if it can change as such, because, as I say, one of the difficulties with Keats, he doesn't write a kind of defense of poetry in the way that Shelley does, or he doesn't write like college writes the Biographia Literaria, you know, so he sets out his thoughts in a very sort of detailed kind of a way. We only have Keats's letters, and I, even in defining negative capability, was sort of conjoining, if you like, two separate letters together, because we don't have that kind of systematic sort of statement from Keats. I don't know if the concept has changed. I'm not sure that it can. I mean, our understanding of it might change and how we choose to define it. And one thing I would say to that is there's been some very interesting work done in sort of rethinking ecological and environmental ethics. Timothy Morton is the person I'm thinking of, who writes a very interesting book called Ecology Without Nature. And he's very taken, I think, with the idea of negative capability, that sense of a kind of dissolution of self. I think partly because it means that it's a self that isn't imposing itself on the world and on nature and looking at nature in a very kind of instrumental way. It's about a much more kind of empathetic, imaginative engagement with natural process and the world around us that isn't kind of selfish in the sense that the self is looking to see what it can extract and make of the world and how it can make nature serve its purposes. And I think he finds something of that selflessness, that kind of dissolution of self and self-interest in Keats's idea of negative capability. So it's an idea that I think still has currency now. I think the most interesting essay that I've read, and perhaps it's slightly different from the account that I gave on negative capability, is by Seamus Perry in that book that came out recently, 2017, John Keats. Seamus Perry has a very interesting, short but brilliantly insightful essay on what he sees Keats's idea of negative capability as being. So that might be another place to go, but it's an idea that's still definitely current, and I think it has been of interest to certain literary environmentalists, ecological inflected literary responses, certainly.
Thank you, sir. And we have another question from Ms. Thaila Anandakrishnan. Her question is, do you think that the poet's dilemma expressed throughout his poetry is a result of his dejection due to his failure in his love life?
Well, I mean, that would kind of hold to. We'd go back to our Yates quotation at the beginning, I suppose, wouldn't we? And we'd have to say that one of the sticky sweets that Keats wasn't able to get in touch with, through that pane of glass at the sweet shop window, was Fanny Brawne, and that there was a great deal of frustration about the inability to, I suppose, move that relationship on, partly because, of course, Keats realized, I think, that economically perhaps he wasn't much of a prospect. I mean, because he gave up. He didn't pursue his career in medicine as he could have done. He gave up in about 1815 or so, 1814, gave up the idea to be a poet. And partly also because, of course, he realizes, a few years later, of course, that he himself is dying of consumption. There's a very moving account that Charles Armitage Brown gives. He coughs up this drop of blood, and he says, there's that arterial blood. That's my death warrant. I mean, his medical training told him that he knew what he had and that it was going to be fatal. So I think there are, I think there are the health factors, economic factors in play as to why the relationship with Funny Brawn wasn't successful, wasn't consummated, wasn't moved forward. It would be, it would be very much the sort of, I mean, if you saw that Keats being unsuccessful, which I'm not sure that he was. I mean, Keats, look at, say, Endymion, for example, that slightly earlier poem, 1817, compared with, say, the Hyperion fragments that he writes 2 and a bit years later. I mean, the change in Keats as a poet is just so marked. But I think we would be with the kind of Yates or perhaps the kind of Marjorie Levinson reading of that Keats's Life of Allegory book that sees all of Keats's poetry, whether it's successful or not, as a kind of allegory for all of the things in his life that he wasn't able to access, that he was economically, politically, socially, and amorously shut out, as it were, from the world that he really wanted to be in. He wasn't able to get at those sticky sweets in Yates's sweet shop window, effectively. I don't know if it means he failed, even if we took that as a decisive biographical moment in Keats's life, which, I mean, it's one of many. I think Keats, whatever it is that he experiences, he's able to produce great beauty from the pain of human existence, isn't he? I mean, there's that wonderful line, isn't there, in an ode I didn't talk about, Ode to Melancholy, where he says, turning to poison while the bee mouth sips. That wonderful possibility of the sweetness that life could afford, and yet at the same time knowing that sweetness can turn to something much more poisonous and painful. Pleasure and pain are very intermingled in Keats's poetry, and they may well have been so in his life. I don't know that that makes. I don't know if that means that the Funny Brawn relationship is the defining factor for Keats. I think it's certainly a part of it, as was the death of his brother Tom. That really painfully registered with Keats, and you can see it in the poem he writes not long after the Eve of St. Agnes. And indeed in Ode to Nightingale. I don't know if that helps, but yes, I think it's interesting. I mean, I suppose what I would always say is you've got to be careful about privileging the life of the poet over the poetry. That there's a distinction to be made between poetic speaker and voice and the ad hominem living biographical person that once was, John Keats.
So if time permits, can we go for another couple of questions?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We have a question from Ms. Ilakia Murugan. She has a query. Why his works are mostly for Indians? Is he favored by the Indian culture?
Keats' works?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I think I need some more information. Is that true of your experience? I mean, is Keats someone that's revered? And so I'm asking you a question. I mean, is that true? Is Keats revered in this kind of way? I mean, he's revered, of course, probably globally. I mean, there's a Keats and Shelley Association of America, of course. I suppose. I'm not sure if this is an answer. I just think there is something about, Keats is asking some of the really big, complicated questions about human existence and about art, isn't he? I mean, he puts it very well. There's a very moving letter he writes. It's that long letter that he writes to Psyche out in, I think. One of the reasons he says he tries to write the Hyperion poems twice is because he's trying to work out why people suffer. And he says, why is it that women suffer from cancers? I mean, he's thinking of back to his medical training again, and he's really thinking and he goes so far as to say, in fact, that the only way that a true identity, a soul, can be made in what he calls the value of soul making is through the whole hornbook of the world, is through suffering. It is suffering that makes us what we are, and forges our identity. And perhaps that just speaks to us. I mean, no,
maybe it's the universality of the theme that he chose that made people feel that it was written for themselves. But
I think that would be a very good way of putting it. I wish I'd put it like that myself. Yes.
And we move on to the final question, sir.
Sure.
It's from Mr. Amol. He says that John Keats was a painter and boxer as well. How can creative mind and the other mind go hand in hand? What is your opinion?
Well, I see no problem with I mean, there have been other poets that have been painters. Painting might be a bit strong. I mean, Keats knew. Keats was a good friend of Joseph Seven, who was an artist, and Joseph Seven does that very famous portrait of Keats where he sat by the bay window with the little table, and then there's a bookcase behind him, and the little portrait of Shakespeare above that. That's Joseph Seven's, I think, famous picture of him. Keats did do a little bit of sketching, it's true. One thing he did sketch was a Seabase vase, which in relationship to Ode on a Grecian Urn, led a lot of critics, early critics, to try to find the urn. They were kind of obsessed with the idea that there must be a physical urn, and that Keats must have seen something that was the source of his inspiration for the ode. And some of them speculated that perhaps the Seabase vase that Keats sketches might have been the source for the ode. I think that's unlikely, personally. I think the Joseph Seven connection is more probable. Keats would have seen the Elgin marbles, of course, when they first came to Britain. He wouldn't have seen them in the British Museum because they weren't there initially, but Joseph Seven had them, and Joseph Seven was doing a series of drawings of them. And I think it's worth remembering that Keats also writes an earlier sonnet on first seeing the Elgin marbles. So I think it's more likely that the urn is a kind of composite, an imaginative composite of Keats' seeing of the Elgin marbles than it is any one particular urn. As for his boxing, yes, Keats was a bit pugnacious, and Nicholas Rowe's recent biography of Keats, The New Life, suggests that Keats, Keats wasn't very much against that sense, or that portrayal of him as being kind of weak and unmanly. Actually, was quite the opposite. He wasn't really tall, Keats, of course. He was only about 5'1", but he was supposed to be quite hardy and physically quite capable. Do I see a problem with being a pugilist and a poet? No. Look at Lord Byron. Lord Byron boxed and fenced and swam and was a great poet. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. No, so I don't see that as being a I don't think that's an impediment to being a poet, that if you box or drink claret. Keats did both.
That's true indeed, sir. And we have the final question. The question is from Mr. Purushothaman. He says that if John Keats would have lived a longer life, he might have surpassed Shakespeare. What is your take on that?
Oh, that's one of those what-if questions. They're always very difficult to answer. I suppose Wordsworth might be our yardstick here, perhaps. Now, Wordsworth, of course, lives a very long life indeed, and doesn't die until 1850. Now, there are some Wordsworth critics that would say that the best of Wordsworth is found in the earlier poetry. Is in the 1790s in particular, poetry that he goes back to and revisits when he's revising the Prelude and so on, and indeed works some of those earlier poems into the Prelude. Some people would say, in fact, that if you were unkind to Wordsworth, I'm not saying I entirely agree with this reading, but Wordsworth goes on, as it were, too long. He becomes more conservative politically and in terms of his the positions that he occupies. He becomes the stamp duty collector for Westmoreland, becomes the poet laureate, and that his kind of, if you like, his creative inspiration sort of wanes somewhat as Wordsworth goes on. So that leaves us with Keats and the impossible what if question, which is, yes, given the exponential, maturation of Keats's talent and his poetic expression within 6 years, it's astounding, absolutely astounding. It just make you think, exactly what if Keats had lived another, 10, 20 years? I mean, don't forget, of course, that, Joseph Severn lives well into the late part of the 19th century, and Severn was a contemporary of Keats. There's no reason why, as it were, Keats couldn't have lived, much apart from obviously the consumption, which, I mean, he was unlucky with the deck that life dealt him, as it were. But in theory, he could have lived much longer. Would he have been a greater poet? I don't know. The question, I suppose, is to be answered with the question: if Keats had lived longer, would he have turned out like Wordsworth or not? And I don't know the answer. I'd like to think that he would have gone on to even greater things, but that is just very hard to speculate. And the evidence is difficult. I mean, there are equally parts that have gone on writing. Look at Thomas Hardy, for example. Thomas Hardy, great novelist, starts his life as a poet, writes these marvelous novels, then spends his latter life producing some of his great poetry in the early part of the 20th century. So I can't really answer that question, only to say that I would like to think that he would have become someone as great as Shakespeare. He certainly revered Shakespeare, particularly King Lear is a play he's always coming back to. And when he talks about in the letter that I quoted a little bit from, he goes on to make a distinction between things semi-real, which are stars and moons and sun, and things real. And the one thing he has as things real is Shakespeare. So he was certainly, his study was certainly looking to the right person if he was going to write with Shakespeare. And he was a great man, not just of Shakespeare's plays, but also, of course, of Venus and Adonis, some of the shorter opinions that Shakespeare wrote. And another key idea of Keats's, snail-horn perception comes from Shakespeare. It's a line from Shakespeare that inspires him to think of as negative capabilities derived from Lear. So I'm not answering the question. I'm not sure I can, but I'd like to think that he would have done. But the evidence that I have based on other poets, it could have gone either way. I mean, Wordsworth arguably had a falling off. Hardy came into his own as a poet in his later life. So, the road not taken and the road never to be taken. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You have really been patient enough and prompt, and you have given a detailed explanation, and have taken almost all the viewers to live along with Keats himself during the Romantic age, that even now questions are being posted. Thank you. Thank you so much for your valuable time. I hand over the session to Mr. Prem.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, sir. As always, it's a delight to have you with us. And I think there was a question that was posted by one of our audiences at the beginning of your session. And it was a very serious one also, and I have to address it. And I think it's the same question that goes on, that will go on in all our heads. The question was, this person was quite amazed, and he came up with the question that how is it possible that one person can know all such stuff?
Can know
all these things, and how much knowledge can one person have? He is quite amazed that you could bring to us so many different things, so many different aspects, perspectives that we have never imagined before. And is there anything, any tip that you could share with us to be as knowledgeable as you?
I think I'm with Socrates. Socrates once said, when he was asked why he was the wisest man in all of Greece, he said, "It's because I know that I don't know anything." But with someone like Keats, Keats has been a friend almost, I suppose, for a very long time. I mean, I wrote, 20 odd years ago now, 22 years ago, I wrote part of my PhD on Keats. I've written about Keats on and off. I've tried throughout my career, actually, to be honest with you, to try to write as much about Shelley as I have about Keats, because I can't quite decide which one I mean, I love them both, and it's very hard for me to determine which one I should, so I've always tried to write as much about either of them. Sometimes I've had the pleasure of being able to write about them together a little bit. But I mean, I've just been looking and thinking about Keats for quite a long time. And I've taught Keats quite a lot too. I have great fun. I teach a course with a colleague of mine in Durham on Keats and Shelley, in fact, which is great fun. One of us does the Keats part, and the other does the Shelley. And sometimes we switch it around, just depends how we feel. But just keep reading.
Great, sir. That's pretty much it, I guess. And and to the audience who are gathered here today, I think many of you would be interested in sharing, getting to know about Professor Mark Sandy's books like Romanticism, Memory and Mourning, and Poetics of Self and Form in Keats and Shelley, Nietzschean Subjectivity and Genre. I think these are some of the books that you could go with if you are.
Well, I hope so. The second one's rather old now. It makes me feel old. That came out in 2005, I think. It has been reprinted more recently now. Routledge have reprinted the Poetics of Self-Informed book, so it is available in all good bookshops, as they say. And I've got a new book coming out too, coming out in January, on transatlantic transformations of romanticism. So it's about Keats and Shelley and Barnes in 20th century American literature. So that'll be out, hopefully in January, in the new year. That's my plug.
So we move on to the final part of this session. That wraps up this episode of Expert Library. I, on behalf of Litreal, thank Professor Mark Sandy for this truly immaculate session that is fitting for this grand occasion of the 225th birth anniversary of John Keats. Be sure to join us again for yet another wonderful episode of Expert Library. We wish indefinitely never to avail ourselves from misery, but in circumstances all, we hope only for the strength to overcome it. A phoenix is powerful. A phoenix can never fall but rise. But phoenix is a myth. People are real. We are real. We may perish to ashes, but our songs, like those of the Nightingale, shall live forever. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and be a part of Litreal, the new standard. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.